Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan and my guest today is Madam Vaira Vike-Freiberga, former President of the Baltic Republic of Latvia and an important voice in European affairs. Latvia is now holding the 6-month rotational presidency of the European Union Council, and you have also been very active on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So let me start with the situation vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. There's a great deal of uncertainty as to how things are going to proceed, whether there'll be peace, whether there'll be war. The Russians rule out the possibility of any conflict, any widening conflict. But how do you view the prospects of the ongoing conflict and the possibility of a diplomatic way forward?
The situation in Ukraine developed very unexpectedly, and the way it's been proceeding has been extremely unconventional, and no wonder it is not called warfare but hybrid warfare. It is a sort of comedy or carnival, except that blood is flowing and territory is being lost in a country whose sovereign borders have been invaded. The worry about it is the following, is that we have had, since the Second World War, a peace in Europe that was first created in the western part of it. The eastern part was controlled by the Soviet Union, either directly by occupying the Baltic countries or by having its strong influence on the policies and the way of governance of the satellite countries. But when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, and in fact starting with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, we felt in the eastern part of Europe that the Second World War had finally come to an end, and that what had started as a reconciliation between Germany and France, which was the first coal and steel union, which was a seed of what has now become the European Union, that this was a sort of logical historical process leading to peace on the European continent worldwide, with the Iron Curtain coming down, with former captive nations recovering their independence. It was hoped that Russia as well would follow the same path of development of the others, in other words, passing from a controlled economy to a free market one. They did that, and with success because of the oil and gas prices. With the passage from a central one-party system to a multi-party system with elections, they did that as well. But we had also hoped that they would adopt the values and the principles that the rest of Europe have been at least making efforts to follow. They do not always succeed as well as they would like, but there's an ideal of Western values that one has put forth. And the first part of it is peace and respect for one's neighbors' frontiers. Even in cases like the case of Hungary, which was very badly punished in the Versailles Treaty after the First World War for fighting on the wrong side and had a lot of its territory cut off, everybody accepted that whatever the situation, one would accept the frontiers as they existed, to then basically establish a union where frontiers didn't matter so much except for internal governance, and we would have peace and security on the continent. In Ukraine, the situation is particularly grave. What is happening now? The borders of Ukraine have been invaded. Its sovereignty has been threatened. Its future existence, in fact, is under doubt if this continues, the processes continue the way they are. And the reason this is particularly tragic is the following, is that in 1994 the great powers met in Budapest and signed a memorandum according to which Ukraine gave up a considerable nuclear arsenal in order to become part of the European nuclear-free zone. And it was then told and this was signed in the memorandum, that its sovereignty and territorial integrity would be guaranteed, in spite of them not having the ability to defend themselves with nuclear arms. They would be guaranteed by the Russian Federation, by the United States of America, and by Great Britain. And now we have a situation where two countries who guaranteed are doing nothing, and the third one is invading the country.
If I can just pitch in that, I grant that there's Russian intervention, but what would your answer be when Moscow turns around and says, look, these are Russian-speaking Ukrainians who have a grievance against Kiev. They formed militias. We may have moral support or moral regard for them, but we don't control these guys. What would your answer be to that? In other words, is there an autonomous element in the insurgency that we're seeing in eastern Ukraine?
I would say there's an element, and it's an absolute small minority, and it's being manipulated by Moscow, who have been planning this for years and years. I have seen this from the sort of messages that President Putin has been putting out, this kind of laws they have adopted in the Duma, and there's a very clear intent on the part of the Russian Federation and of its president to re-establish the former territory of the Soviet Union, and indeed President Putin has mentioned the former Tsarist territories, you see, so which is a very dangerous ambition to have in a day and age when we are looking forward to peace and stability and collaboration between nations.
Now as a Latvian and as a European statesperson, are you prepared to treat the Crimea differently from eastern Ukraine? And in other words, regard what's happened in the Crimea now as a fait accompli and focus on rescuing the situation in the eastern Ukraine so that Ukrainian territory is not further compromised? Or you think that the Crimean annexation or accession itself can be and has to be reversed?
The attitude of the European Union is the same as of the Western countries towards the situation in the Baltic countries when they were invaded in 1940 by Stalin's forces and also annexed to the Soviet Union forcibly under arms. The Western powers never recognized the legitimacy of this annexation, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were able to recover our independence without bloodshed and get the support of all those nations who had never recognized the legitimacy of this annexation. Crimea was a sovereign part of that territory which in the Budapest Memorandum was guaranteed to Ukraine after it gave up its nuclear arms. If we want to think of a world, never mind.
But historically it was part of the Russian Federation. It was ceded to the Ukrainian
but
Socialist
all
Republic.
of Europe has ceded to somebody or another at some time or another.
But this was fairly recent.
We should become subject to the Vatican if we go far enough into history, because we were Christianized by crusaders who were sent by Pope Innocent III. If you start digging into European history and start redrawing frontiers, as I said about even back to the First World War in the case of Hungary, Europe will be soaked in blood once again, which it has been too often in the past.
But do you think sanctions, which is the preferred method that the United States and its European allies have adopted, is working? Is it effective? Or do you think it's closing the option to a diplomatic settlement or diplomatic process?
Well, you see, the diplomatic settlement is impossible frankly, to achieve in a situation where a country invades another under the pretense of actually not being there. First, they send in their special forces, really the best trained people in their army, tear off their insignia. They fight, they advance the territory. They're constantly bringing in heavy armaments. And it's not heavy armament. You don't buy these rockets and tanks and rocket launchers at your corner grocery store. These are not rebels who one day woke up because they're unhappy with Kiev and picked up their pitchforks and their knives and guns and started fighting. These are people who are fighting with the armaments and the heavy armaments of the Russian Federation. And in fact, President Poroshenko at the Munich conference was branding brandishing an armful of passports of Russian officers who had been captured on Ukrainian territory, which is still now, you see, sovereign, and 100 kilometers from the border, saying, we went for a walk and we lost our way, you see. So it's a farce, and it's a very ugly farce.
So command and control of the rebels, you're convinced, is firmly in Moscow's hands?
There's absolutely no doubt about it. These are bands of people who see an opportunity for getting careers, for rising, for looting and everything else. But Moscow has been preparing this for a very long time, as it prepared the intervention in Georgia, and as it continues to do in Moldova by making sure that the Transnistria conflict remains a frozen one.
Is this driven by the desire to grab territory, or is it linked to the fate of Russian ethnic minorities in these countries? To what extent is that a driving factor?
The Russians have
your understanding of the Russian motivation.
The Russians are very clever at picking up what are keywords that push the buttons of the Western world. And one of these is the rights of minorities. This is a fundamental principle in Europe. And they have discovered, then, you see here, we have the Baltic states, Latvia particularly, which was heavily industrialized and heavily Russified, with the idea that they could never become independent again, because they would simply, the Latvians were deported to Siberia in vast numbers, by the tens of thousands. Others, like my parents, about 250,000 fled to the West as refugees and remained in the West. And meanwhile, factories are being built in Latvia, and Russians were flooded in with the idea of Russifying the territory and making sure that if ever there was a referendum or something of the sort, it could not be independent. So Russia had been, there's a continuation of President Putin's policy of that under Lenin and Stalin and under the Tsars. And then he said as much.
So are you worried?
Many say that he is seeing himself as Peter II.
Are you worried then that Latvia may be next?
If we were not members of NATO, it definitely would be next.
So you think Article 5 is a sufficient
But we have received absolute assurances, both from the Secretary General and the major nations in NATO, and small ones as Portugal as well, that yes, we take Article 5 seriously, even if little green men without insignia should start trooping around with heavy armaments on our borders. This will be taken as an invasion of territory, because the idea is that this is a dress rehearsal for a comedy that is being paid out by invading a country and pretending that you're not there. It's a discontent Russian population who's being saved from, and the Russian propaganda tells of the horrible things that are being done to them, which are absolute lies. We have had for years also heard how we oppress our Russian-speaking minority. And I explained to President Putin, everybody except the president in Latvia was forced to speak Russian in Soviet times.
I want to stop you there because we need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll pick up on this thread of Russian minorities in Latvia and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. Please keep watching Rajya Sabha. Welcome back to Indian Standard Time. My guest today is Madame Vaira Vike-Freiberga, former president of Latvia. We've been discussing the crisis in Ukraine, triggered by Russia's intervention there. Before we took a break, we were discussing Latvia and the situation of minorities. At the start of the interview, you expressed misgivings about Russia not adhering to Western values when it came to wider social political values. But elsewhere in Europe, you'd be hard-pressed to find citizenship laws that are as strict and rigid as that of Latvia when it comes to the requirement. I mean, somebody born in France, even if they don't speak French, would still be a French citizen. But you have nearly 30% of your population who have second, third, fourth generation Latvians in sense of living and being born there, and perhaps are not fluent in Latvian, but they are denied political rights, they're denied citizenship. Doesn't that conflict with Western values?
No, it does not. First of all, we do not have the strictest laws. You should look at the ones that they have in Switzerland. Okay. Mind you, it's not part of the European Union. Germany recently made some easing of its citizenships. It was much harder than ours. And ours are extremely easy. All you have to do is apply for citizenship. you have to answer a few brief questions, including the fact that it's true that, which is some find very hard, is that Latvia was not liberated in 1940 from a fascist nationalist government, but it was an independent country that was invaded by the force of arms and annexed by the force of arms. It recovered its independence in 91, and to learn a Latvian anthem, which only has 2 stanzas. It's not like the Marseillaise, where you have, I don't know, 5 or 6, and most Frenchmen don't even know it. So that the citizenship requirements are ridiculously easy. But when people say that to recognize that Latvia was occupied is to them something unacceptable, then we have an ideological difference, and we have difficulty in accepting people like that as loyal citizens of a newly independent country.
But does somebody born in a Latvian family have to apply for citizenship?
We have now children born in Latvia from now on. All they have to do is register to be citizens. It used to be that one of the parents had to register. Well, the baby can't register itself, obviously, you see. But now the idea is that they are, instead of having to be registered by one of the parents, if they're registered, their birth is registered in Latvia from now on, the babies born in Latvia will be Latvian citizens.
So the child of a Russian-speaking mother and father will automatically, automatically qualify for that. So in a sense, you are changing and making it more liberal.
Whereas those who came in Soviet times, who were born in the Soviet times, because there was a lot of movement of populations back and forth, you see, not to mention the mass deportations that the Russians effected of Latvians to Siberia. But the application for citizenship has to be done for those descendants of immigrants who didn't register immediately after independence. My parents left when I was a small child. A whole generation, in fact 3 generations, have grown up in exile, and some of them didn't realize that there was a limited time when they could register on the jus sanguis basis. Not jus solis, but jus sanguis, being descendants of Latvian citizens who were robbed of their citizenship with the Soviet annexation. Well, they had to go through a naturalization process as well. That too we have now changed and eased. So we have changed the law.
The reason I'm dwelling on this aspect is because it's now acknowledged by many commentators, even politicians in the West, that the Ukrainian government mishandled its language policy, made it rather too rigid, triggering fears among Russian-speaking Ukrainians. So perhaps that is a factor after all in
that is
this
a ridiculous
crisis.
argument, if you may forgive me for saying so, because I have been in the Crimea and many Latvians travel to Donbass and various other reasons on business. And what they have told me and what I have seen myself is that when you go to these countries, it's much like what happens in Latvia, by the way. We have Latvian as an official language, but when I go to a dental clinic or someplace else, I hear Russian all around me, and the Russian inhabitants come and demand services in Russian and get it. Our courts translate to Russian-speaking speakers their pleas and their lawyers. This is taken for granted. It's not written into the law. It's absolutely taken for granted. And in the Crimea and in the Russian sort of majority regions of Ukraine, Russian has been the language and continues to be, and nobody ever had any pressure against them. But the Ukrainians in Soviet times, believe you me, if you look up Ukrainian history, the purges that they suffered, the Golomodor, the huge starving of millions of people under Stalin's time against that nation, that's a completely different story. It is ridiculous to compare those kind of pressures to the situation where officially the country has Ukrainian because it wants to revive the Ukrainian language, which has been oppressed under Soviet rule, and they try to extinguish it. But any Russian speaker in those parts, believe you me, much like in Latvia, they can get by speaking Russian, and nobody has ever made difficulties for them. It is an absolute lie.
Right. Is there a worry in Latvia that with 30% of the population being Russian, 27%, the so-called Latvios, that were they to one day become full citizens and exercise political rights, this may also change the complexion of Latvian politics and may... we've seen, for example, Mr. Ushakov, the mayor of Riga, has quite a different attitude towards sanctions against Russia than the Latvian government.
He has, in fact, a treaty with Mr. Putin's party in Russia. And since Riga was heavily Russified under the Soviets, it still has a substantial Russian population. By now, the Latvians are barely the majority, whereas they were becoming a minority before. But yes, and they vote for his party rather than the Latvians splitting up in between 4 or 5 different parties. So that yes, they took power in the biggest city in the country. It has half the economy of Latvia, happens in Riga. And yes, we have this Russian party who have been ruling there, but so far they have been loyal to the country, and Mr. Ushakov's apparently is not going to Moscow on the 9th of May celebrations.
Latvia, like the other Baltic republics, was an enthusiastic recruit to NATO and to the European Union. I want to talk about the EU in a second, but one more question about Ukraine. Do you feel that this crisis will eventually end up with the Ukraine either being in NATO or giving an undertaking that it will not be in NATO? In other words, that the question of Ukraine's relationship to NATO may be quite fundamental, one way or the other, to resolution of this crisis.
Yes, I think that is true.
Which would you favor?
The Ukrainians themselves have been split on that. And I don't mean just Russians versus Ukrainian speakers or ethnic, because so many of them are mixed. By the way, in Latvia, 20% of the marriages are mixed, and if this keeps up, we won't have a Russian minority anymore. We hopefully will have a unified population, but it will take a few generations more. But the point is that the decision of the Ukrainian governments until recently had been to try, like many third world countries did during the Cold War, to steer between the two. After all, being neighbors of Russia, being such close, having close economic ties during the whole Soviet period, being very integrated into that economy, and having these historical ties. Kiev and Rus was the birth of Russian civilization. St. Petersburg was just an unhealthy swamp, and Moscow a muddy village, when Kiev was a center of Slavic civilization. This is where it came from. This is where it spread from. So they have this kinship, if you like, of culture and essentially, close languages, but they're different enough to be called different languages. The Ukrainians used to have extremely positive feelings towards the Russians, and for the first years of their independence, they were very, very careful not to get too close to Europe, and certainly not to talk about NATO, because they wanted to keep this position. Geographically, one doesn't choose one's position, and they happen to be there between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. They have been very careful and treading on eggs.
Did Europe err in pushing Kiev towards making a choice one way or the other?
Not at all. You see that this is
the
Russians are saying that this is a European invasion. Mr. Putin has even said at one point, and I was wondering about his sanity a bit, that the Swedes were attacking them, because please, since Charles XII, there hasn't been a Swedish attack anywhere. It's a neutral country. And the idea is that they're being attacked, and Europe is weakening Russia and so on. Europe has been literally coddling Russia. They sat them at the NATO table. Lord Robertson was very proud when he said, we have this NATO-Russia summit, and I'm so pleased. I never thought I'd see it, that between R and S, between Portugal and Spain, we would have our Russia sitting with us at the table, looking forward to a peaceful and collaborative future, for heaven's sake. So this is where Ukraine has been very reticent. And I must say that both the Americans and the Europeans, especially the Germans, are reticent as well. They are, to be quite frank, they're scared of the Russians. They want to pacify the Russians. In fact, at the conferences of Yalta and Tehran, Roosevelt and Churchill fed us to the Russians, not just us in the Baltic countries, but the whole Eastern Europe, the West, actually, in its own self-interests, and in order to get an ally to fight against Hitler, which was threatening them, sold us down the drain. And they would be ready, they're certainly ready to sell Ukraine down the drain if it threatens their own security.
The breakup of the Soviet Union was contributed to as much by the Russian Federation at that time as by the desire of each of the former republics to go their own way. Why are you so convinced that the Russian Federation now under Putin wants to revive.
He says so. He says so. And not just once, but he repeatedly.
No, but not in terms of territorial aggrandizement. I mean, it's more the idea or the vision of Russia playing an important role once again in global affairs. Surely you don't suggest that he's coveting Latvian territory, for example? Or you think he is?
Indeed, he was. They were very much against us joining NATO, because, of course, then it would be the Crimea scenario all over, or the Georgia, the South Ossetia or Abkhazia scenario. The tanks march in, the rockets march in, and it's fait accompli, and everybody throws up in arms. It's pity. It's too bad. That's done. Now it's not the case.
So you think if Latvia had not joined NATO, you would be in the same boat as Ukraine today?
I'm quite convinced of that. Right. Alas.
Right.
Alas.
Well, we're completely out of time. We didn't have a chance to discuss much about the EU, but thank you very much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And do join us again next week, same time, another interesting guest. Thank you for watching.